Ism Deutschnin Hoplagsa, some get to Hanak Gantkobolta, Tar Marsden, Naking Flaes, Hopes Kama Keldwin Sawid, Bakaneda, Dagi, Hopes Bakla Hip, and Jagai. It's, oh, sorry, a little louder there. Okay. It's a great honor to be included and to be invited to speak to you today. I'm going to look for Adrienne. She's supposed to be doing the slides for me. Where did she go? Or her helper there. Thank you. Yes, so I've been invited to talk to you today, and I know that some of the other speakers have covered a little bit about free entry and the mineral tenure regime in what is referred to as British Columbia. And so it might be a bit of repetition. I apologize if that's the case, but speaking with the organizers, it's always good to reinforce some of the material as we go forward and to really bring home what this system of mineral exploration means, how it affects our Indigenous rights, and what we can do to better protect our Lachiep. Okay, next slide, please, thanks. So what I'm going to try and cover today is free entry. What does that mean? What does the free entry system mean in practice, and how does it affect Indigenous rights and Gitxsan rights and our Dahket and our Ayok? I'm going to go into the Kekatla case, or Gekala. That was a case that has just been ruled upon at the BC Supreme Court, what that means, and our role as Gitnyao in that case, along with other nations and other interveners. Tony is here as well as one of the interveners in that case, so thanks for his support. And then where do we go from here? This case calls for some reforms in the Mineral Tenure Act that have been long overdue, and where do we go? What are we looking for in terms of changes on the ground and in legislation? Then I'll get into some of the Ayok, the modern Ayok that Gitnyao have developed, with me being sort of the point person on many of these, and so I can speak to them through my experience and through the work that I have done for the hereditary chiefs in Gitnyao. And these are the tools, the Indigenous sovereignty tools that we can all utilize to, again, have more of an influence, more of a say in how and where mineral exploration occurs in our Lachiep. And there's a couple examples there, and I've got a lot of time on the agenda. I don't know why they gave me so much time, but I appreciate it. I know I'm at the end though, and maybe people are, it's a lot of information to take in. So to keep things kind of engaged, I'm gonna pause at sort of the end of each of the sections and just open up the floor for questions and comments so that you don't all have to wait for the end and get kind of backlogged. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is free entry? And it's pretty simple. It's, what it sounds like. It's free. And who's it free for? It's free for Umshua who want to go out and get minerals. And that's the history of this province, is built on the gold rush in the 1800s, is really built on this notion of access to land, access to resources, and the ability to do that unfettered by, uninterfered by Indigenous people whose land that they're actually in. So this piece of legislation called the Mineral Tenure Act has changed very little since the gold rush, since the 1800s. So it's one of the most archaic and outdated pieces of legislation in the province of British Columbia. And again, there has been calls for reform for decades for this legislation. And basically what it does is it gives individuals or companies the exclusive right to a specific area. So it says if there's going to be anyone who's going to get access to the resources underground here, the minerals, it's going to be that individual or that company. And so it creates tenures, and they are then registered with the provincial government, and the provincial government then goes about regulating the access to those areas. And they also issue notice of work permits. And so those are the permits that you actually get consulted on as Simgi as your staff. You do not get consulted on the tenures and where they're established. This is a big problem. This is why the free entry system has been called for change for a long time, and why we were forced into court to seek this change. Next slide, please. So, and this isn't just an innocent bystander, the provincial government in this process. That's the way they portrayed themselves through this court case that I talked about. That, they don't even get notified themselves, that they're not making actual decisions when tenures are being registered, but they have promotional materials like the one seen there. This is how, company or individual, if you want to stake a claim in BC, this is how to do it, and they have a whole process. And basically, within a few minutes, anyone who has access to a computer can register a claim on unceded Indigenous lands without any notification, consultation, or consent of Indigenous peoples. And this was in, the early days of the gold rush was physical staking, and so that's where we would see the surveyors going out and physically staking areas. That no longer is needed. They can now do it online, and you can do that from anywhere in the world. And so we have companies from around the world who have access, who have tenure, who have rights in our lands today, and all of that done without consultation and consent. So the challenge here is that the government and the mining industry has been saying and arguing against reform because they say this doesn't create any physical impacts. It's just a tenure. It's just registered on a map online. But what it does is it actually creates an economic interest that we then have to argue against or prove that our use of the land is equal to or superior economically. And so this is the example with Gitnao and the Neziad, which I'll talk about later. When you want to conserve an area, when you want to protect it, you have to prove an economic case because the mining industry has been seen as superior to other uses of the land since colonization. So I wanted to just stop there and say that this, the organizers of this event asked me to remain neutral, and this is not about being against mining, and I 100% agree. So in Gitnao and many other nations that I've worked for, there are places where mineral exploration is acceptable, where the risk is low, and that there are agreements that can be in place to ensure consent, to ensure proper mitigation measures and environmental protections. I also have a lot of family, as many of us do, who work in exploration camps, who have companies, many WILP companies operate and provide services to exploration. So this isn't about being against exploration, this is just about reforming the system through which it happens, through which it's authorized, and ensuring there's more Indigenous involvement and consent. So mineral tenures are essentially governed and regulated by the Chief Gold Commissioner. And so when we go to court, this is who we went up against, was the Chief Gold Commissioner. And so this is another very outdated, archaic position. And so, as you know, when there's an election, there's people who are elected. They are elected as your member of Legislative Assembly, like Doug Donaldson previously, and Nathan Cullen now. And then they go and maybe they get a position in cabinet, and if you're not happy with their work, you can vote them out. But the Chief Gold Commissioner is not elected. This is a very powerful position. There's no oversight or appeal process for the decisions that a Chief Gold Commissioner makes unless you go right to court, which is what was forced upon Gitnao and others. So it's an unelected position, it's appointed. Very often it is somebody from the mining industry who's actually in that position and so has a lot of connection to mining companies and may return to a mining company position once they leave the position of Chief Gold Commissioner. Next slide, please. So in the whole province of BC, it's sort of currently a two-zone system. So if it's not a park, if it's not a other type of protected area, then it's essentially open for potential mineral exploration. So overall, this is about 76% of the land base. I'm not saying that all of that is covered in mineral tenures, but it could be if there was interest. And so this two-zone system was really reinforced with the previous BC Liberal government, and so the calls for change, the calls for better land use planning, and better design of mineral tenure development came about with the new government, but they have taken very little action, to be honest. So other jurisdictions have reformed these systems, these free entry systems. So we've seen changes in Ontario, Quebec, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories, and internationally we've also seen changes in Australia. So this was a common practice back in the day when people were out and they were trying to basically get those exclusive rights. You know, that free entry was a system that worked in colonization. It was an effective way to bring in non-Indigenous people and to give them a stake in the land and a stake in a future country or colony. But many of these jurisdictions have moved away from it, and BC is pretty much one of the last ones to do so. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to stop there, see if there's any questions, any terms that I'm using that is either unfamiliar, or any comments that you wanted to make before I go on. Is there a roving mic? Someone? Yeah.
I don't see any hands up though.
Okay. Okay, go ahead, next slide. And you can also just interrupt me too. Okay, so the Gagapa case. So this was brought about, when did it first start? It's definitely been over close to 2 years, I would say. And so the story behind this, so many people who think that there are not a lot of impacts with mineral exploration will sort of point to the small footprint, as well as a couple drill pads. A lot of our people build drill pads and maintain those for their work. There's some core shacks, there's maybe a camp, there's helicopter traffic, but what's the big deal? Like, there's not a lot of environmental impacts with exploration. That's the argument. But with Kikatla, they had advanced exploration on Banks Island, and so that's off the coast of Prince Rupert. And that company left a real mess, and they are still cleaning up that mess, and there's no one really accountable for that cleanup. And so they've seen, out of all the nations in BC, probably one of the highest amount of environmental impacts just from exploration. So you've heard this morning and over the past day, what are the impacts of a mine? A mine that's in place for 50 plus years. Those are significant. That's why we have environmental assessment. That's why we have all of these measures to assess those projects. But exploration is supposed to be, theoretically low impact. And what they've experienced in Kikatla is the opposite. It's high degree of impact. The rights that company got were from the provincial government through the Mineral Tenure Act. And so this is the source. This is the source of the legal problem that Kikatla brought forward. They were joined by the Hadasat, and so as soon as they launched their case, another nation from Nachalneth on Vancouver Island brought a very similar case. And they saw it as an opportunity to say, yes, we have the same concerns. We would like to also bring a case forward. And the BC Supreme Court said, we're going to hear these two cases together. They're arguing the same issues, they have the same concerns, and it's the same piece of legislation that is the target. And so it's called the Kikatla case, but it's also the Hadasat Nation, as well as the interveners, which I'll talk about. Next slide, please. So we got our decision September 26th. So very recently, I'm really happy that happened before I got to come and talk to you, because I didn't know, we didn't know how long that decision was going to take. And so the hearings at the BC Supreme Court wrapped up back in spring of this year, so April and May. And I just really want to acknowledge, I just met with the Kikatla this morning online, and the dedication of their elders, their Simgiget, their Signamhanak, in this case was so overwhelming, and it reminded me so much of the Delgamuukw-Gisdewe court case, and seeing our people in court day after day and listening to the really disparaging and disrespectful arguments that were being made by the province, by the industry, and the denial of our rights, the denial of our ayuk, our systems of law and governance. And they were tireless in that, and they were all elders. I did not see anyone kind of younger than myself there representing their nation, and so I really want to acknowledge them at every chance I get. Swagat Nis Haiwas, in his statement after the decision came out, said, the status quo has shifted profoundly. We didn't get everything we wanted in this decision, but we're not going back. This is not a case of going back to the status quo. It's about moving forward with a better system in place. Samagat Mali from Gitniao, in our press release, said, the gold rush is over. After how many decades, it's finally over. We are not going to see that unrestricted access of Amshua coming in and claiming rights to resources, claiming rights to minerals, for which they have never secured proper consent and proper agreement with the Gitniao and the other nations. Next slide, please. So, as an intervener, Gitniao hereditary chiefs appointed me to submit all of the evidence. And so my role as WILP Sustainability Director, I oversaw all of the permits that came through. I assessed those through the land use plan and through other modern IOC, which I'll talk about. And basically putting forward over 100 pages of affidavit material and going through old records, records of consultation or lack of consultation, things like when we tried to create a no registration reserve, which is the way to say no claims can be staked in this area. We brought the Chief Gold Commissioner out to Marsden back in 2017. At the time, it was held by Mark Messmer. And we said, listen, we've found new information about where salmon are spawning. They're more productive in this stream that historically has not been productive at all. It's not protected, and it has a whole bunch of mineral claims on it, and we would like to expand our conservancy. And there was a series of notice of work applications that were put forward to explore in this area, and we had a dispute resolution process that resulted in the Chief Gold Commissioner coming out. We went on the banks of Strong Creek, which is called Sikalan in our language, and they witnessed the spawning sockeye, and they said, yeah, that's pretty undeniable. This is salmon habitat, and all surrounding that creek is all glaciated mountains, and the rush that's happening now is that as glaciers are melting, there's new areas that are exposed, and mining companies, it's like a mini gold rush with climate change, which is really quite sad. So anyhow, telling this type of story, all of those meeting records, putting that forward as evidence in the case, and after that, after we met with him, he says, yes, I can consider, my role as Chief Gold Commissioner, I can consider a no registration reserve. That's in my power to do so. And so we thought, well, that's great, that's really promising. And he goes back to Victoria. The next day, they issue those notice of work permits, and they simply say, just don't drill in the riparian. Which of course, nobody drills in the riparian anyways, they're usually up in the higher elevation areas. But our point was that these tenures were granted without our consent. They were granted not recognizing our salmon values. So we follow up with him, and he says, no, I'm not going to create a no registration reserve because there's too many mineral tenures in this area. And so it's a chicken and egg thing. It's like, you can't stop new ones from being created because there are already ones there. And so when you're trying to protect sensitive areas, it's a huge barrier having these tenures that, again, maybe they haven't had an on-the-ground impact, maybe they haven't even done any exploration, but they are now, the prioritized use of that land is mining over conservation. So that's sort of the story of what we experienced with free entry and how that was communicated in the court case. Next slide, please. So the Kekala decision, the other really neat thing about it was that they had both their hereditary and their elected leaders representing them in the court, in all of the media and the public relations. And so this quote is from Chief Counselor Linda Innes. And she basically just says, the courts have finally said what we knew all along, is there is a duty to consult. The Haida court case of 2004 at the Supreme Court said, whenever you're planning anything on Indigenous lands, you have to consult. If there's an impact, there has to be consultation. And the Mineral Tenure Act had just skated by without any legal challenge. And finally, we have this decision, we have the recognition and the declaration that there is a duty to consult. Next slide, please. So again, going back to the arguments that we heard against us in court. And so we heard from the government, we heard from the industry, and they said, what are you worried about? We consult you at the notice of work stage. That's when there's real impacts on the ground. When the tenures are established, there's nothing to worry about. And what the interest is, what they call it in the colonial law, is it's called chattel interest. And so it's this tying of a individual or company to that place in a way that gives them a priority right, and that cannot be basically canceled without compensation. And so there's a compensation regime. So if we were to establish a protected area and government had to cancel those mineral tenures, they would pay that company between $250 and $850 per hectare. So this is a formula that's been developed with Ministry of Energy and Mines for years, and in cases where there are new protected areas and they do have to cancel those tenures, there is that compensation in place. So that's that economic argument that the province is making back to us, right? So what are the impacts? This is the evidence that Ginyao and other interveners and Kikatla brought forward in this case. And we kind of categorize these impacts in these main categories. So first, governance. So the Delgamuuk decision, as you all know, was about choosing how to use the land, choosing what is okay and what isn't okay in your own Wilp territories. That's governance, that's Dachgeb, that's Ayok. So you can't make decisions if there is already an interest there that is superior to every other interest. You can't make an informed decision if you weren't even notified that those tenures existed in the first place. Next is environmental. And so the Banks Island example that I talked about is the key one, a lack of oversight, a lack of monitoring, a lack of regulation of environmental impacts through exploration phases. So one of the concerns that we have raised through exploration is that they need a lot of water. So they draw water normally from a creek, and they use it in the drilling, they use it in drilling mud, and they release it usually back into the same water body. And there's new advances, you know, there's advances showing that there's minimal impact and that they can test the water and that it's fine going back in. But when we have years of drought, when we have less snowpack in our mountains, when we have less water available for salmon downstream, any use of water is going to have an impact. And those water usages actually don't require permits. So everybody else in the province who wants to use water has to apply for a water permit, but mining is exempt. And so we don't even get to be consulted on the water permits and how they use those. Economic impacts. So mineral tenures, when they're established, they pay a fee and then they pay a rent annually. And none of us as Gitxsan people are able to have any revenue sharing for that. So we get revenue sharing if a mine is developed, if there's forestry, you know, those types of revenue sharing agreements. But these are fees that the government is collecting off our lands, and there is no sharing back with the affected Wilp. Similarly, they then create a value, a certain value. And so one example in the Ginyao territory, in an area that we were not opposed to mining, which is in the Kinsquish area, there was a bundle of tenures that were bought and sold for, $2 million. And that's a private transaction. We have no knowledge of it unless someone tells us about it. There's no oversight, no consultation, but there's also no revenue sharing. So again, someone's taking funds, taking resources, and selling that off to other companies, and there's no sharing back with the affected Wilp. Cultural and spiritual, of course, prioritizing the economic value of a land or an area or a water base or a water body, it views that Lahip in a way that is denying the cultural and the spiritual value, and it prioritizes economic value over all else. The judge in this case did find that there were impacts to cultural and spiritual areas from mineral exploration, and that was that impact that would trigger the consultation. And then lastly, capacity. And so we all want to, build up our Wilp. We want to build our internal capacity and teach our young people and to develop our own programs and develop our own business partnerships. And if we are constantly fighting these battles and having to litigate and having to negotiate, it drains our human capacity when we could have just done that reform as the government had promised years ago to do. So those are just the types of impacts. These are the mineral tenures in the Meziadin that I talked about. So the lake there, that's Meziadin Lake. This is Wilp-Wilitzk territory. And all of those mineral tenures were established, some of them very recently, and even with this court decision, people can still go out and stake further claims because there's no interim protection measure even after the court ruling. Next slide, please. So these are all of the interveners, and I think what this case really showed was that there was very few people on the side of the government. So on the left is the First Nations, and on the right is the government, Chief Gold Commissioner. And so there's a couple associations of mining companies, and these are the really hardcore lobbyists. They go and they meet with government regularly, they donate to the political parties, and they really try and keep this system in place. So not all mining companies are reflected in those associations. There are companies that are doing better, they're trying to reach consent, they're trying to enter into agreements, but the associations are really more politically focused and more about maintaining that ultimate access and ultimate priority of mining over other uses of the land. So Kikatla and Hadasat, we had Nakazli Witen, they're from the Fort St. James area. We had Gitniao, the Siwalaks, which is from the southern interior, Nuhok, which is the Bella area. Human Rights Commissioner actually stepped in, so the Human Rights Commissioner is an independent officer that looks after human rights in BC, and they stepped in and tried to provide arguments in support of analyzing and applying the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People with regards to the Mineral Tenure Act. We also had Tony's company, the First Tellurium. So there's a company saying we actually are in support of this. We're not opposing what the First Nations are saying, and we would like to have a little more level playing field when we are seeking consent-based agreements with First Nations. And then a whole bunch of other NGOs, First Nations organizations. So a really strong showing of support and a strong coalition going forward as we look at legislative reform. And next slide, please. Justice Ross come up with. So he says, yes, there's a duty to consult. It's been triggered. I've applied the HIDA test. And the impacts that have been shown by the nations is grounds for a triggering of the duty to consult on mineral tenures. So there was a couple other things that the nations asked for in terms of relief, and that they were not granted. And that's the disappointing part of this. So legislative reform, there was an ask that is the Mineral Tenure Act unconstitutional? And so that means looking at Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, is the Mineral Tenure Act unconstitutional? And Justice Ross said no, it's okay, you just need to fix it. Just fix the Mineral Tenure Act, but we're not gonna deem it unconstitutional. UNDRIP. So this is UN Declaration and then the provincial legislation, which is called the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. So this was a first test. This was the first time this government, who has passed legislation now, implementing the UN Declaration, was sort of put to the test, is what does this mean in provincial courts, right? And very narrow interpretation. He says it doesn't create justiciable rights, I can't even say that word, but it's an interpretive aid. So it's just nice to know, it's just guidance. It doesn't have any teeth, which is not what people fought for to get the Declaration Act. So a very disappointing outcome on that front. Another piece, he didn't quash any of the permits. And so all of those notice of works that I talked about, everything, the rights to go out, the rights to go out and explore, do work on the ground, the tenures behind them. He says, yes, there's no consultation on these tenures. I'm not disagreeing with that, but I'm not going to quash them. I'm going to give you 18 months, provincial government, to go out and fix this. Work it out with First Nations, reform the Mineral Tenure Act. He didn't provide any interim measures either. And so during this 18-month window, there could be, and what we heard this morning on the call, is there are companies out staking more claims now because they know that they may be eligible for compensation once the reforms come in, or they may want to preserve things and get grandfathered into a new regime, which is what happens when there's new legislation. So during this 18-month window, there's a lot of work, I guess, that needs to happen. There's a lot of work that other nations, including Gitniao, have already done to say what we want to see in a new Mineral Tenure Act, so that we can draw on that. But what we heard this morning, which was really a sort of further disappointment, was that the government is going to wait until after the election to do anything. And so they're going to wait till the very tail end of that 18th month period and to not make this a hot button kind of election issue. So not a good start, but definitely there's a coalition that's being built, and we invite Gitsan to join us in that and to make joint submissions to the government to speed up the reform process and to have it led by nations themselves. Next slide, please. Okay, now someone has a question. Yes, Ed. Repeat it for you. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Question I have is there a retroactive period that this would apply to, like for maybe first contact or when Undrip first came out, stuff like that? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's nothing in the decision, but there's nothing stopping us as First Nations people from saying that. You know, that's the reform we want to see. Because if they're truly doing UN declaration, that means co-developing new legislation, then they could include that. So that's something we would then, if we want to kind of build a coalition, that we should ask for that as a retrospective. And that's one of the things that Danielle has also called for is compensation for the past revenue that's been taken. Yeah, thanks.
Brilliant, Tara. Your nation must be very proud of you. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. I was looking at that last slide, if you could go back to it again, the 18-month grace period. Like, you know, they never gave us any grace period ever. Like, how did that get to slip in there? Did the, Carla, is that am I pronouncing correctly? Did they see that coming?
So the government asked for that. I think they knew kind of from the get-go that they were going to, the duty to consult would be triggered. They tried to argue against it, but it was kind of clear throughout. And they asked for, if there's going to be a decision that tells us we need to change the Mineral Tenure Act, we would like at least 18 months. So they actually made that timeline, and now they're saying, oh, well, the election. So
Should have been lots shorter, I think, 6 months.
yeah. And this, you know, I should say, like, the appeal is not off the table yet. We won't know until the 30 days. So there's a period where any party can appeal a decision, and that's not up yet. So that'll be up at the end of October. So there's definitely grounds for appeal here. But then what happens? Then it's more years of staking and more years of impact. So.
And the other part was that I was looking at the list. It was like, you know, David against Goliath kind of thing, you know, like big heavy hitters on the government side, you know, with all the big titles, and you know, the gathering together of numbers won. So, you know, that's what we all need to do. Thank you, Tara. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate your kind words. Okay. Oh, yes.
Just a question on your previous, before you had your other break, you spoke about advanced exploration and impacts. Could you let us know what the difference is between advanced exploration and just general early exploration?
Yeah, there might be better experts in the room, but I'll take a stab at it. So basically, early exploration can just include, like, you know, foot surveys, you know, going out and sort of just assessing, and then they get into drilling, which many people are familiar with. They're trying to get core samples out, test those for different minerals. Advanced exploration, I think, I'm trying to think of a local example. I think Nipple or Snip, maybe? So they're not, they don't have a full mine plan permitted, but they are beyond just doing random sort of sampling and drilling. And the Banks Island one, I believe, was, yeah, either advanced or in between.
Did it just die? I seen the red light on earlier, so. Okay. We've got batteries.
Yeah, the Banks Island one, I believe, was either just before advanced or advanced. So much more permanent infrastructure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I asked, because you mentioned about the detriment to the environment in advanced exploration versus not knowing what the difference is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so these junior companies, and they're called junior mining companies, so they're going out and raising capital just to do this work, right? And so they have to sort of get enough capital invested to go out and start the early exploration. As it gets more advanced, it's much more likely that they're going to obviously be applying for a full-blown mine, environmental assessment of mine permit. Good, okay.
There's one more
Oh,
question.
one more? Okay.
Thank you for that awesome presentation. Tiffany Denny here. So my question is in regards to the Gold Commissioner. So you say that shared that it was an appointed position and they were from that area, that's where they work. Is there a way to change that?
Yes. Yeah, this is all things that can be raised in the legislative reform, right? Is that you can have, you can claw back the powers of the Chief Gold Commissioner. You can make that position be elected. You could make that be a joint appointment from Indigenous people in the ground. Like there's all types of solutions, I think, that have been developed over the years. But yeah, the Mineral Tenure Act and the powers of the Chief Gold Commissioner definitely are ripe for reform alongside how the tenures are created in the first place.
So would it be in the interest of actual change to take segments of that and target them individually rather than one big movement?
For people who are just learning about it, it sounds like a lot, but for people who've been working on this for a while, it's like there are answers out there, there are recommendations, they just haven't been met with, you know, the government hasn't received them. And now there's a chance, and so we need to kind of like dust off all these old reports and recommendations that have been made over the years, because there's a lot of wisdom in them. But now that we have the UN Declaration supposedly being recognized, exactly that, who should the Chief Gold Commissioner be? Should there be one? Should there be an Indigenous oversight body under the Mineral Tenure Act? There's all sorts of like solutions that could be brought forward.
You could almost see that as just that point of the Gold Commissioner bias as being a point of potential litigation.
Yeah. And this is the same with the Chief Forester. I don't know if you know about the Chief Forester. So there's the Minister and then there's Chief Forester. Chief Forester gets to make a whole bunch of decisions, is again, unelected, appointed, often comes from industry. And this is the design of the colonial system. It's been like this since contact, right? It's designed to empower corporate interests and to empower industry over Indigenous people. Okay, let's carry on. Next slide, please. So there is support for us. That's the good news. There was some polling done. This was during the court case, and this was done by our friend Nikki Scoos in Northern Confluence and the BC Mining Reform Network, so a group of NGOs. We're really supporting Indigenous people to have more control and more say in mineral exploration. And so they found that 72% of British Columbians believe that the province should seek consent where exploration should occur. So this isn't, 20 years ago when a lot of people were very vocal against Indigenous rights, period. We're very vocal against, negotiating treaties or anything that we were trying to do. And so the public opinion has kind of shifted in our favor. And so again, a good opportunity to push for really groundbreaking reform. Great example from Tiffany of the role of the Chief Gold Commissioner. Next slide, please. So, what do we want? So this is a submission that I prepared back in 2019. So government, when they came in, Doug Donaldson was there, he was our guy, we were hopeful, and they said, yep, we're gonna reform the Mineral Tenure Act, and went to a couple meetings in Vancouver, everybody was there, we're all excited. Great recommendations, all the nations were saying the same thing. We want land use planning, we want mining integrated into land use planning, we want areas of protection. We want to have consent-based processes and agreements in place for any mineral tenures. Everybody was in agreement. And government took that and they went to industry and they said, what do you guys think? And they just killed it. It just ended. That was it. It was done. We never got anywhere, and then we had to go to court. So this is all kind of based on what Gitnell put forward back then. So the first thing is don't tinker with it. Don't do these little rinky-dink minor changes, and call it legislative reform. Exactly what Tiffany was saying, upend the whole thing. Maybe something completely different is needed. And it sounds like, from what we've learned so far, that it is. So the land use plan that Gitnell has, and I know that the Upper Nass chiefs here and other watersheds are already doing the land use planning similar. And so it's a perfect time for you to integrate that, to have a mineral layer in your land use plans. We don't have that in the Gitnell land use plan. We want to add that now. Ours is a forestry-based plan because that's what is in our territory. We have a smaller amount of mineral tenures, but where they're located is the main concern. So what we want to develop is a 3-zone system. So if you remember, I said there's a 2-zone system right now. There's parks, protected areas, and then everything else is a free-for-all for exploration. So a 3-zone system could look like areas protected, so absolutely no exploration. Those have to be designated and designed with Indigenous involvement and consent. Areas that are open, but with special management. And so this might be a bit of a yellow light, not a red light, but a yellow light for industry to say, yeah, you can explore here, but you might not end up getting a mine out of this area if you find something, because there are these special considerations. And so it's sort of that cautionary zone. And then areas open for mineral exploration, and these are areas that you've done your homework, you know that there's no high fisheries values, or there are areas that, you know, have been impacted previously. I mean, those might actually end up being the smaller areas of the whole system, but at least you have them on the table. You're saying, yes, there are some areas that we will allow this. And really, the nations get to determine for themselves, so there's going to be this new provincial legislation. We all have to live with it, but we're all unique. You know, Nakazli, Watan, and Nukok, and Gitnell, and Gitsan, we're all different a little bit. We're all unique. And so we need our own systems to say, this is how we want to ensure free, prior, informed consent. And we have, in our examples, access agreements, you know, WILP consensus records, all those things that show, yes, we actually did agree to this. We weren't just given a bunch of money and got tempted and sold out. Next slide, please. So the first one on there, that's the question Ed asked, so a compensation regime. And so this is in the UN Declaration. It's called redress. It's in multiple articles in the UN Declaration. And that is past compensation for impacts from mineral tenures that have been generating revenue off of our lands for decades, over a century in some cases, and there's no sharing that's happened back to the affected Indigenous people. Similarly, when there's a sale, when there's a private transaction, there needs to be a way to step in and say, if a bundle of tenures are being sold, that we would like 10%, 50%, whatever that is, of that revenue coming back to the nation or the WILP. In addition to that, transparency around those transfers. And so if you are reviewing your referrals that you're getting for your WILP, you'll see those referrals if they want to transfer a forest license. So they will consult you. That's what the HIDA court case declared, was that there needs to be consultation when there's a transfer. Because all of a sudden you're dealing with a whole new company, you have to make a whole new relationship, you don't know who they are, you don't know their track record, all those things. And so we need transparency around that, disclose, and then seek consent when those transfers are happening. And then lastly, Gitnell has been pretty vocal that it's great to have the support of our bigger First Nation organizations like the First Nations Leadership Council, Assembly of First Nations, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. They're great advocates for our rights, but they can't be leading this reform. They don't have the capacity, and they can't go out and engage all nations. It has to be driven by nations themselves and have flexibility for government to government uniqueness, whether it's through agreements or through land use plans. And so there needs to be some customization and not just a one-size-fits-all approach. And next slide, please. So that's sort of the basics of what Gitnell would be seeking. We've also, like I said, there was other nations that we had meetings with back in 2019, and then this coalition that's building out of the Kakatla case. And so, yeah, those are the things that we would like to see as sort of the main changes. And if there are other ideas or other questions or thoughts about the legislative reform, I'll open up the floor again. Kevin in the back.
Thanks, Sarah. Just a quick question, maybe directed towards you. reform some of their free entry policies, I guess. So I'm kind of going, is that kind of the direction, you put up a list of some of the stuff that, is wanted in for the mining and legislation. So I was wondering, is that kind of aligned with what was kind of reformed in other policies? And then a second question to that, before you answer that one, was you put a list of some of the organizations and First Nations organizations that were supporters of the court case. Just like one of the things that came across today was, or yesterday, I was seeing was a First Nation mining council. I was just kind of saying, I was kind of wondering, that was kind of an introduction to that organization. So I was kind of curious where they stood on that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Kevin. So in the other jurisdictions, I think they got away from the absolutely no notification. I know that. Tony or others that have spoken might be able to speak better to those like Ontario, Quebec and stuff. And maybe you can come on and grab the mic if you want. But I don't know if there's, I guess I'll say it this way. I don't know if there's any jurisdiction where I'm thinking, yeah, we should do exactly what they did. I think it has to be a made in BC approach, just because we have 204 First Nations. We have a government that's adopted the UN Declaration, and we have, a very complex legal landscape and a lot of precedents through other court cases. So I think it has to be above and beyond whatever reforms have already happened in other jurisdictions. And then the second question on the other organizations. So First Nations Energy Mining Council has been around for a while. They are like an advocacy group under the First Nations Leadership Council, but they, and this is why Gitnao has really been vocal about saying, no, this has to be led by the nations, is they do cozy up to government quite a bit and end up kind of speaking on everybody's behalf without having appropriate mandates. And so we really need to be careful of that. They're an Indigenous organization, but they have a lot of, Upshaw staff, and it's just a little too close to government sometimes. And it's not on the ground. They don't know what our day-to-day life is like. They don't know what we're dealing with. They don't come out and talk to us. And so how can they go out and represent us to government? But they're good. They advocate. They come out to the press conferences. They support us, that kind of thing. But it's who gets to say what should be in the new act? That's what's really important.
When dealing with government, either provincially or federally, they come up with solutions that are cookie-cutter solutions, and to them we're all one race, Indians, I guess. So I'm curious to know how this could pan out. Wouldn't it be more advisable that we come up with our own policies for the Gitsan?
Yeah, that's what I'm going to get into next. So this is sort of getting all the bad stuff out of the way and then get into what we've been trying to do, and we always share with Gitsan, and yeah, 100%, that's sort of the main closer I wanted to bring to this, is there's a much more empowering approach to develop our own modern IOC around this. And then when they come to consult you, you can say, this is what you have to align with. Show me how you're aligning with our mining policy or our water policy or whatever you want to call it, right? So yeah, definitely. Let's move forward then on that. So again, these are things that I've been involved with directly, and so I take my direction from the Syndicate, but these are things that I kind of have my hands on every single day, and so I feel comfortable talking about them. And really the Syndicate and Gitnao have taught me, first and foremost, about Belgians, that we are just here temporarily, and we are stewarding our Lachip for the future generations. And yes, benefits and revenues and all that is important, but if we're leaving a mess, if we're leaving an empty basket for the next generation, then we haven't done our job. And so I take that very seriously. So you may know the land use plan has been in effect in Gitnao for 10 years. My main role there has been implementing it, making sure companies are following it. So that's the main foundation for everything, right? It took the chiefs 10 years to get that. And it's so well designed. It's got all of our wildlife areas, our riparian areas, our water management units. It's all set out spatially on the territory. And then you say, okay, well, if there's mountain goats in this area, what are the restrictions we want to put on mining? We know that they're sensitive during the winter months, during their calving time. So we need to limit helicopter traffic within 2 kilometers of the mountain goat winter range. Things like that, restrictions, areas of no development, areas of development with certain restrictions. The land use plan is, again, like I said, forestry based, and that was and has been the main industry in Gitnyalakip for a long time. And the areas that have mineral tenures are in the north part, in the White River, in the Meziadin, in the Willoughby, and then down in the sort of the middle west part of the territory in the Kinsquish area. So those are the main areas of focus. But because the Meziadin is so important, it's just the mining and the work that we've been doing on this has become so much more important because that area is so important, not only for Wilpwilisk, but for all the people who go up to Meziadin, get fish every year, and benefit from it. So to that end, when we came up against these roadblocks in the Meziadin, trying to expand what we have with the Hannah Tintina Conservancy, the government was saying, well, you know, we can't get rid of those mineral tenures. We need to focus on the economy, blah, 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 all the jobs, you know, all those arguments. And we tried for 6 years to expand that conservancy. We said, listen, we have a land use plan, it's government to government, and we're supposed to change it when we get new information. We brought that new information about the salmon, what they were doing in light of climate change. And government just said, oh, no, sorry. And so we had no traction, no movement for 6 years. And then we just said, well, look at these other nations. Look at Chilcotin, look at Tlogquit on the island. They have tribal parks. What's a tribal park? Let's go look at that option. So we looked into Indigenous protected areas, tribal parks. There's different names, but they're all kind of the same idea. It's Indigenous-led conservation. So in 2021, we established the Meziadin Indigenous Protected Area, and we notified, we consulted, as a government would, we consulted those mineral tenure holders. We said, this area is important, we do not want you to explore here, but we want to hear from you what your feedback or your concerns might be. And they did not respond. We sent them a draft management plan, we invited them to our events, no response, no response. And so we are doing that, enacting that in the IOC. This is a modern IOC, so designating an area. Winnenit did so for their whole territory, and others may do the same. Others may want just a smaller part of their territory protected, but it's a great tool. It's a great movement as well of other nations, and I'll show you who else is doing that. We also have our WILP Sustainability Assessment process. So this is our way of getting out of environmental assessments. We went to so many meetings with government for the Northwest Transmission Line, for KSM, for Avanti, all these projects. And it was always the same. You know, they listen, blow off steam, they go away, they write a report. No adverse effect, no adverse effect. Project approved. Anything of substance is going to be dealt with in permitting. Permitting basically just goes back to the certificates. As well as certificates there, the permit should be there too. So it's a very flawed and sort of empty, meaningless process. So we developed a WILP Sustainability Assessment process. It took us 2 years. We worked with West Coast Environmental Law. I highly recommend, if you want to create modern IOC for the Gitxsan, that the West Coast Environmental Law can do that with you and support and make sure that it translates. It doesn't have to match, but it translates into colonial law so that they can't escape it, they can't ignore it. So we're in implementation now of that. We're reviewing the SK revitalization mine, and we're doing that under our own process. We're not participating in the provincial process. And we've asked the province to simply recognize the outcome of our process as our own expression, our own decision, representing either consent, what we call nadinch, or a lack of nadinch. Also developed the AX IOC, which is our water policy. This just launched 2 weeks ago, and really excited about this. You heard another example this morning from the fellow on Zoom about the Carrier Secondary and their water policy, so we learned from them, always sharing information, learning from other nations. And this talks about water quality, the standards that should be upheld in the Lahip, as well as quantity, how much water is needed in the face of climate change for fish to survive, for our ecosystems to survive. And so it puts restrictions in place, and again, it's telling government, it's telling industry, this is the standard you have to meet if you want to come in here. Another tool is access agreements, and so this is with companies. This is where you can, lay out what you want in terms of a consultation process, a consent process, what you'd like for jobs, employment, revenue sharing. We have these for both forestry and for mineral exploration. Monitoring enforcement, the Lahip Guardian program has been in place for about 7 years, and they monitor to ensure all of these plans and management directions are being followed. They can go out and monitor that. And also if there are things that are wrong, they can report back to the chiefs, and then we have to raise that with government to take action. And then last, we are doing this as a new way forward. It's the old way, but it's the new way, right? It's like people like me just sick of dealing with government, honestly, and saying, why can't we do this on our own? And then when they come to us, we're more prepared. We have, like the chief was saying there, we have our own vision that we can uphold. But we do have to have something in place to deal with government, unfortunately. And so we have a recognition and reconciliation agreement, and that spells out the shared decision-making process, all the process steps that have to be followed. If they don't follow those, they're in breach, and we don't have to respond. And so I know you guys have something similar with your engagement agreements and things like that. So something that just spells out the rules of the game for when they are approaching you and trying to consult. Next slide, please. So this one is just, I know there's some interest in Indigenous protected areas from a couple of the chiefs that I talked to earlier, and so I just wanted to show you that we're not alone, that there are others who are working on this. And so just for your reference, the early ones that I talked about, so Cloquet, that's on the island, Dasico, that's the Chilcotin one, and we approached them, we just said, how did you guys do it? What did you do? And they said, oh, well, we did a declaration, we had a ceremony, and then we communicated our management direction. And so we just kind of followed their steps and then built on it and made it more our own. There's others, so the Gwinnett one, that was a couple years ago or a year ago, Taku River Tlingit, Denike Kusan up in the far northeast, a couple down in the southern interior. We're also building alliances with the Ashnola IPCA, that's Lower Smilkameen Indian Band. A couple on the coast, Kitasuhehe. So yeah, it's really exciting just to see this resurgence of Indigenous protection and conservation in their territories, and just wanted to share that kind of visual with you. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about this already, but I just want to kind of bring in the facts for the Meziad Indigenous Protected Area, just because it's tied so closely to free entry, right? So this is why we had to go out and develop this. Was because we had these threats from mining. We had denial from the provincial government that they were going to expand a conservancy. We were just sort of up against a wall in terms of our options. So 2021, as I mentioned, we learned from the other nations, got the information together and said, well, what should we do? Well, we should have an event. We should have it out on the territory. So we invited our neighbors, Kirby and Charlie and a few others from the Gitsan came, Guksen, the Father Clan for Willits came and witnessed and affirmed the business in our IOC. We invited our neighbors, the Nishka, we invited the provincial government, the federal government, and at the time the province was told they weren't allowed to go. They were told that if they participated, they know what witnessing in our laws mean is that you're agreeing, and if you don't agree, you have to say so or you have to leave and give back your gifts. So this declaration that was signed by the chiefs protects 54,000 hectares. That's all the areas that drain into that creek that I talked about, Sikalan. So it's all steep elevation, steep mountains, little bits of glaciers at the top. Then Surprise Creek drains into Strome before it goes into Meziad Lake. So we protected all the drainage area of the entire watershed or sub-watershed of Meziad. So we harvest about 10,000 sockeye per year. There's also an economic fishery that is in its second year now of operation. And so there is jobs being created, there is sharing of the wealth of the sockeye. Anyone who goes up that's Indigenous, Greg will usually share and let them take fish. So it feeds much more than just the whelp. So we had those multiple mineral tenures in the area that I talked about. And basically to communicate, because if you have an event, that's one thing, but you need that written record and to show government and industry, this is our vision for this area. So the WILP, with my support, developed the management plan, and we had a consultation period for that. We invited comment, we invited feedback, and then we finalized that earlier this year, and it's now available publicly. We're also in negotiations with the provincial government for them to now recognize our protected area. And so before, we were going to them and saying, oh, can we please expand the conservancy? And it's always asking permission, always in that place of defeat and just being subjected to colonial rule. And now we're saying, this is our IPA. This is how you can align your provincial designations to our vision. So it's really flipping the table on them. Next slide. So just a couple photos really quickly. So that's Margaret Willis, that's Gregory Rush. We had our song and dance group come up. So a lot of the Wilp School in Gitwangak go up every year and they teach the kids about fish preservation and dip netting. And so they have come up for both the events that we've had. So in 2021, that was the original event. That's the declaration being held by Willis there. Next slide, please. We also created a documentary film. It's called Honey Talk, Our Food Table. And this was just as a public relations, public education, so people, if they want to know more, they can go and watch it. It's only 39 minutes. It's available on Vimeo, and it's won multiple awards at different film festivals and was produced by Volvo Productions. Next slide, please. So the management plan, like I said, it's done now, it's out there. Basically, it's very short, it's very simple, easy to read, it's not too technical. It just says, what can you do here and what can you not do here? So no mining, no forestry, no pipelines, no other extraction under the ground, whether it's gas or other resources, other subsurface resources, no transmission lines, but economic fishery, yes, tourism, yes, angling and guiding, yes. Exercise of Aboriginal rights, that's the one thing that's very restrictive about parks. It's parks, you have to get park use permits for all these different things. It's very restrictive. It doesn't let us live on our lands freely. And so that's what an IPA is. It's different than a park, but it still has the same protection against major industrial development. That's available on our website too if you want to look. Okay, next slide, please. So we had a second anniversary event this year in August, and we invited Dr. David Suzuki, and he actually came, which was really cool. I guess he has a cabin up in Iskut, and so he came by and was our guest speaker, and got to try out dip netting, and really just got to see, what is different about Indigenous conservation, and that it isn't about a pristine park where no one's allowed to do anything. We're actively living there. We're actively doing things on our land, and it's not just about recreation for Umshua people. And he was great. He spent 2 days, I think, with Willis, toured the whole area and went out on the boat, and yeah, it was great to have him. And next slide, please. But really what it's all about is those future generations. When I bring my kids up there, and we always bring one of my daughter's friends, or my son's friends, and family, and it's just so beautiful to see them in the water, dealing with the fish, learning how to cut them up, learning how to pack them, and just seeing for the first time them interact with salmon it's so powerful, and it just really keeps us going when we're up against so much with government and industry. The next slide, please. And that's all I've got for you today, and we'll open it up again. Doig, sit this.